and welcome to this video for higher biology, which today is going to be looking at evolution. Now, this might be something that you're not feeling particularly confident about. It was covered probably a little bit in S3 and then some more at the end of National 5 in the Life on Earth section. You may have gone back over it looking at evolution and natural selection. If that's something that you're not feeling wildly confident about, then it might be worth just going back just now and instead of finishing watching this video, pause it for a bit, Google Stated Clearly videos and look for the one entitled What is Evolution? And that is 8 minutes long, or 8 minutes and 52 seconds long. If you watch that, it gives you a really good overview of the evolution process. If you're still struggling a little bit after that, maybe perhaps go and look at theirs on what is natural selection as well. They just explain it very well, very clearly, and it kind of covers all of the stuff that you should already know, perhaps with a little bit extra, but generally speaking it's going to cover the background and the basics that you'd already be expected to be quite confident about going into this. So if you've done that, or you're thinking you're fine and you're ready to go with this one, then we'll carry on to look at what it is you guys do need to know. So we're looking at the causes and the effects of evolution. And you need to be able to explain what is meant by the terms evolution and natural selection. You need to be able to describe the different types of selection as a result of the phenotype frequencies. You need to be able to compare vertical and horizontal gene transfer and explain which of those makes evolution faster in prokaryotes. So when we talk about evolution, you might recognise something like this, the evolutionary tree, where we've all started from one common life form. So you, at some point, were the same thing as a sponge. So evolution is really the gradual change in characteristics of a population of organisms over multiple generations, successive generations, and that's a result of variation in the population's genomes. So essentially what we've got is each individual member of a species shows some kind of variation, usually as a result of a mutation passed on to them by their parents. As a result of that variation, some members of the species are better adapted and more likely to survive, and as a result, that particular variation gets passed on to the rest of the successive generations and ends up with the process of evolution. And we're going to go into this a little bit more. So we had Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace were the guys who came up with this theory, suggesting that the main driving force for evolutionary change is in fact natural selection. And natural selection itself is a non-random process that results in the increase in frequency of particular genetic sequence that give an advantage to members of a population that have them and helps aid their survival. What does that mean? Well, if you look at this quick example, although as I say, this is something that you should already be fairly familiar with. If we have these guys here, these weird looking bird things, let's say these are some little birds living in the rainforest. And our first little bird here has produced more offspring than the environment can support. What does that mean? That might mean that there's not enough food available. It might mean that the climate isn't adequate to support that number of individuals. It might mean that there's a lot of predators around looking for a lot of food. So we've got more organisms than our environment can support. And not only that, but all of these organisms also show some kind of variation from each other. Now, they are all going to struggle to survive because we've got more of them than our environment can support. There's going to be some kind of issue, meaning that not quite all of them are going to make it. Now, who does and who doesn't make it isn't always completely random. It might be that, as we said, these guys live in the rainforest. It can be quite dark. There's not necessarily an awful lot of bright light. So this guy is more likely to get eaten because he's easier to spot against the dark forest floor. So there we go. He's gonna go for it, and he's gonna get eaten by our predator, and that means he's gonna die out before he's able to reproduce. So because of that, this particular variant isn't able to be passed on to the next generations. Those which are better adapted to the environment, the fittest, are going to be able to survive and they're going to be able to breed, and pass on those adaptations to our offspring. So if we look at this guy here, he's had 2 further offspring. They don't show any variation to the parent, but they do show variation to the other members of their generation. So we've still got that kind of variation. Now, they're the lightest now, so actually it looks like our predator's come along again and has been able to spot them and eat them, so they've not survived to pass on their variant to the next generation. On the other side, this guy, he's had his offspring as well, and we've got another little bit of variation here. We've got some even darker offspring coming in. Again, they prove fitter than the other members of the generation, so they're more likely to survive passing this variant on. So over time, our organism is evolving. We've got a gradual change in the characteristics of a population of organisms over successive generations, and that's as a result of the variation in the genomes. So when we look at natural selection, what we often look at it in terms of continuous variables. So if you remember from when we talked about variation before, we talked about continuous and discontinuous variables, with continuous variables being things like height, mass, skin colour, hair colour, and they're all controlled by many genes, and that's described as being due to polygenic inheritance. And on a graph, you would see that as a normal distribution curve. Natural selection can affect how that distribution actually occurs. So our normal distribution curve, if we're looking at human height as our continuous variable, if this was how tall you are, say this is going from 1 metre to 3 metres, let's exaggerate slightly, and the number of people who meet that criteria, so the number of people who are only 1 metre tall is very small, there's not many of them. The number of people that are 3 metres tall, there's not many of them. People tend to fall somewhere in between the two. So this is what we refer to as a normal distribution curve. The largest number of individuals tends to be around the middle rather than at the two extremes. And natural selection, that process we've just talked about, can actually affect this normal distribution, can change it from being normal to being something else. And there's a few different types of selection which looks at that. So the first one that we're going to consider is stabilising selection. And that's when the selection pressure, whatever's in the environment, changing who is more or less likely to survive, goes against the extremes. So it's going against our very, very small and our very, very large, and it's sticking somewhere in the middle. So we're going against our extremes, and this could be very light or very dark, for example. If you think of the little birds example that we've just looked like, it might have been that selection pressure selected against those extremes and was going somewhere towards the middle. Now, as a result of that selection, as we say, our distribution might change. So rather than having that nice normal distribution curve, we might have it pressurised. So it's going against the two extremes, we're going further towards the mean. So eventually our distribution curve looks more like that one. Now, a good example of this is actually human birth weight. It tends to remain within a range of between 3 and 4 kilograms. So babies with a much lower mass than that are more susceptible to disease, are less likely to feed well, and therefore are less likely to survive. Those with a higher mass are more likely to have more difficulties during birth. And up until not all that long ago in the terms of evolution, any one of those situations would probably have caused those babies, and potentially the parents, or the mother certainly, to die out. So as a result, those particular traits wouldn't be passed on. So in this case, we've got stabilising selection. We've selected against the very small and the very large, and we've selected for those in the middle. Another type of selection is directional selection, and that's quite common during any period of environmental change. So the selection favours a version which is initially less common, and that shows a shift in the mean value. And what that would look like is that over time we're seeing a shift towards our top end of our extreme. It could also go the other way, it could go lower. In this particular example, it's going towards our end extreme. We've still got the same shape of curve, but we're moving everything up, so it's directional selection. We're moving in a particular direction to get rid of our original curve and moving the entire shaped curve further up the graph in the other direction. So a good example of that one would be European black bears, which increased in mass during every ice age. Really larger bodies are going to lose relatively less heat than smaller ones. So over time they got larger and larger and heavier. And that's directional selection. And as I say, worth noting that it could also go in the other direction. The last type of selection is when we have disruptive selection. And that's when the selection pressure, so the environment, is selecting for extreme versions of the traits at the expense of the intermediate ones. So we're looking to select for the edges rather than for the middle. And that could result in a population being split into two groups. So if we're going away from our mean, you could eventually wind up with two separate groups occurring. If you think of, for example, you probably looked in National 5 at the peppered moth, so the light and the dark versions. So over time, anything in between has been lost. And that is actually what we refer to as one of the driving forces behind sympatric speciation, which is something that we're going to look at next time. So up until now, we've just been looking at natural selection relating to variation being passed from members of species to members of the same species over generations. So that's referred to as vertical gene transfer, where we're moving information from parents to offspring, and then they become parents and pass it on to their offspring, and so on and so forth. However, prokaryotes are a little bit different. They reproduce using asexual reproduction, meaning that they don't need another partner. And genetic material is just copied and made into a clone. Their offspring is just a clone of the original. As a result of that ability, they can carry out what we call horizontal gene transfer. And this can go from an individual of one species to an individual of the same species, or it can go from one species to another species. And that can result in a very quick and very fast evolution, because it's much quicker to get a gene from a neighbouring organism than it is for waiting for one to evolve, essentially. So that resulted in very fast evolution of prokaryotes. However, that doesn't always work. It's not always the case that the transferred genetic material is actually going to give any kind of advantage. It's still possible that there is quite a bit of horizontal gene transfer in modern day prokaryotes, so bacteria that exist at the moment. And we've seen this through the resistance to antibiotics. That's been seen as one individual prokaryote bacteria is developing the antibiotic resistance gene. It's very quickly able to pass it on to another, meaning that those genes are going from bacteria to bacteria. So you should be able to give the definitions of the terms evolution and natural selection, describe the three different types of selection as a result of the phenotype frequencies, and compare vertical and horizontal gene transfer, and explain which of those makes evolution faster in prokaryotes. As ever, please let me know if there are any questions or if there's anything you didn't quite understand.